You already know what you need to do. You have known for months, maybe years. The practice that would change your health, the work that would change your finances, the habit that would change the entire trajectory of the life you are building. You know what it is, and you are not doing it. Not because you're lazy, not because you lack intelligence or desire, because every time you approach it, something inside you generates a resistance so precise, so specifically targeted at that exact action that it feels less like procrastination and more like an invisible hand pushing you back toward familiar ground. That is not weakness. That is your biological autopilot doing exactly what it was designed to do. And understanding that mechanism, not fighting it, not shaming yourself for its presence, is the only path to the discipline that does not feel like discipline. The discipline that feels like return, like alignment, like finally moving in the direction the deepest part of you has always known it was meant to go. Carl Jung spent his career studying the relationship between the conscious will and the unconscious forces that override it. And what he documented was not a deficiency of character. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of how change actually works at the level of the nervous system. The people who appear effortlessly disciplined, who wake at 5, who do the hard things first, who move consistently toward their most difficult goals with a quality of ease that makes the rest of us question something basic about ourselves, are not more disciplined than you. They have simply aligned the conscious intention with the unconscious program. And the unconscious program, once understood, can be worked with. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to show you how. Your brain does not value discipline. This is the first thing to understand. The brain values survival. Everything else is secondary. And survival, from the perspective of the ancient neurological structures that run the biological autopilot, means sameness. The familiar is safe. The unfamiliar is threat. Every new habit, every uncomfortable practice, every action that moves you toward a version of yourself that does not yet exist registers in the amygdala as departure from the familiar, which registers as danger, which activates the full suite of biological mechanisms designed to return you to the known, the tested, the safe. This is why willpower fails. Not because you are weak, because willpower is a conscious resource attempting to override a biological system that evolved over millions of years to be nearly impossible to override. The cortisol floods. The discomfort intensifies. The mind generates increasingly convincing reasons why today is not the right day, why the conditions are not quite ready, why starting tomorrow makes more sense. And you listen. Not because you chose to, because the biological autopilot is running the show at a level that precedes conscious choice. Dispenza calls this the biological addiction to the self. The body has memorized who you currently are. The cells anticipate the emotional states of your current identity. The nervous system is organized around the habits, reactions, and patterns of the version of you that already exists. And any attempt to become a significantly different version, a version with different habits, different capacities, different automatic responses, is experienced by the body not as growth, as threat to its current organization. The body will fight to remain itself, and it will use every tool available to it, fatigue, resistance, distraction, self-doubt, to ensure that the familiar self is the self that persists. Subscribe to Hermetic Mind right now. This channel was built for the person who understands that the real obstacle is never external. It has always been the invisible architecture of an identity that was formed before you could choose it. Subscribe as the decision to understand that architecture, rather than simply fighting against it. Carl Jung identified something that the discipline industry has never fully addressed. He called it the problem of the unlived life. The practices you cannot seem to maintain, the discipline that keeps slipping, is not, in most cases, a problem of motivation or willpower. It is a problem of shadow alignment. The shadow contains every version of yourself that was placed outside the permitted range of your current identity. including the version of you that is capable of the discipline you desire. That version exists. It has always existed. It was not lost. It was placed in the shadow at some point in your formation, when being that disciplined, that committed, that different from the people around you, felt like a form of departure that was too dangerous to permit. The child who worked hard and was told not to show off. The adolescent who committed deeply and was mocked for caring too much. The adult who started building something and heard, from inside their own mind, the voice of every person who ever suggested that people like them don't do things like that. The capable, disciplined, committed version of you was not destroyed by those experiences. It was placed in the shadow. And the shadow, as Jung documented across 50 years of clinical work, does not disappear. It accumulates pressure. It generates a counter-frequency, a psychic frequency running in permanent opposition to the conscious self's stated intentions. This is why the discipline feels so specifically personal, because it is personal. It is the shadow's version of you rejecting the conscious self's attempt to become something the shadow has not yet been invited to participate in. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung's most essential instruction, it will direct your life, and you will call it a lack of discipline. It was never a lack of discipline. It was a divided self trying to move in two directions simultaneously. But this is only the surface. What I am about to show you is where the neuroscience and the Jungian framework converge into a single, practical, immediately applicable understanding of how discipline actually changes, and where most people never reach because the shift required is more internal than any productivity system ever suggested. The void. Before the biological autopilot fires, before the resistance activates, before the shadow's counterfrequency begins its work of pulling you back toward the familiar self, there is a gap. Viktor Frankl called it the last human freedom, the space between stimulus and response. In that gap, in the 2 seconds between the moment you decide to act and the moment the resistance arrives, the nervous system is momentarily undefended. The void practice is the deliberate cultivation of that gap. Not meditation in the traditional sense, not passive observation. The active, practiced, increasingly rapid ability to step into that gap and perform the action before the biological autopilot can mount its defense. The alarm sounds. The gap opens. You move. Not after the internal negotiation, not after the mind has generated its reasons. In the gap, before the negotiation begins. Dispenza calls this firing the new neural circuit before the old circuit can complete. Every time you move in the gap, before the biological autopilot can redirect you, you strengthen the neural pathway of the new identity, the disciplined self, the committed self, the version of you that the shadow has been protecting behind its walls. And every repetition makes the next one slightly less resistant, because the body, which cannot distinguish between genuine experience and genuine identity, begins to recognize the disciplined action as part of who you are, not an aberration, not a departure from the familiar itself. This is the law of reverse effort applied to discipline. The harder you effort toward discipline from a place of self-judgment, forcing the action against a resistance you have shamed yourself for having, the more the biological chemistry activates, the more the shadow's counterfrequency intensifies, the more divided the signal. But a consciousness that has done its shadow work, that has recognized the disciplined self as exiled rather than absent, and has begun the process of reclaiming it, approaches the same actions from a completely different internal position, not forcing, returning, not overcoming resistance, removing the reason for it. The reading of reality changes when the identity changes. The same morning, the same alarm, the same practice waiting to be done, feels different to a nervous system that has begun to recognize the action as an expression of who it is, not a demand imposed from outside. The discipline does not become easier because you got stronger. It becomes natural because it became yours. You do not need more willpower. You never did. You need the shadow work that reclaims the version of you that was placed outside the permitted range of your current identity. You need the void practice that creates the gap before the resistance can close it. You need the understanding that the biological autopilot is not your enemy. It is a system protecting a self that is ready to be updated. And the update does not come from force. It comes from the gradual, consistent, shadow-informed process of becoming someone for whom the discipline is simply what they do, not what they force, what they are. The psychic frequency of the disciplined self, once integrated, once moved from shadow back into conscious identity, broadcasts a coherence that the nervous system recognizes as home rather than threat. And the actions that once required maximum effort to initiate begin to arrive naturally,